It's amazing to see what technology can do these days. In the upcoming industry presentation, we'll hear Rajesh Devnani, Vice President Hitachi Vantara, speak on real cities powered by artificial intelligence. Welcome, Mr. Devnani.
Good morning and hello to all of you, and welcome to this ETGovernment National Governance Virtual Summit. My name is Rajesh Devnani, and I work as a Vice President with Hitachi Vantara in the Digital Solutions Business Unit. And Hitachi Vantara is the digital infrastructure services solutions and products arm of Hitachi Group. So we're a global organization by scale, headquartered in the Americas, but having a good presence in the India region as well. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is real cities powered by artificial intelligence. And the term I chose, real cities, is deliberate by design and not smart cities, because we need to make our cities more real. We need to make them more livable, where people could breathe fresh air, where cities are sustainable from a long-term perspective, where cities provide a more equitable environment for its stakeholders and citizens. So that's why we call them real cities as opposed to smart cities. But the idea is still the same in terms of how do we achieve the utopian vision of moving on to providing a better quality of life for the citizens of the city. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about a couple of AI-based use cases, which enable us to move towards a vision of real cities. But essentially, the sphere is endless, right? The number of use cases one could conjure or think of from a real smart cities perspective is endless and limitless. In the interest of time, we'll cover a few strategic ones out of that. So, but before we get there, we need to talk about what's really happening at the world at large. I mean, a lot of statistics point to the world's global population urbanizing, and 2050, we are talking about 10 billion plus people, out of which 70% are going to live in cities. Now, that's going to be massive change. But even if you look at the short term from an India standpoint, I think we are looking at least 120 million people migrating to the cities by 2030. So in effect, what you're doing is you're adding one Australia every 2 years to the cities in India, which is a massive amount of people entering. And that really leads to a whole host of problems that the cities have to face up with. So we are facing what we call as the urban sprawl. And it's got an effect and impact on multiple aspects of the city. Cities are deteriorating. And as you can see, it's manifest in the sort of abysmal ratings that we are seeing from a urbanization standpoint as to where India stands. Clearly, there are a lot of drivers, a lot of metrics that India is doing pretty well on. But this really calls for, there's a lot of scope for us to improve things as far as the urbanization goes of India. So having facing these headwinds, what really are the choices we have? What do we face as possible choices to have better outcomes, better quality of life for various citizens and stakeholders that live and work out of those cities, and how do we really improve upon them? So, like I said, the topic of my discussion, it is all about artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence clearly is no utopia on its own, but what's really happened is that over the years, there's been a sort of confluence or a holy trinity of three phenomena that has happened. One is data is growing, and data is growing at voluminous scale, right? So we are looking at exponential growth in data. And the data sources themselves have grown. Now, everything being sensorized is leading to a lot of data, whether it be in the city's context or the industry's context. So there's a lot of data growth happening, and data is really ripe from a mining perspective, from a mining standpoint. And coupled with that, what we're seeing is exponential growth in the compute as well. So when I say compute, I kind of bundle that along with the compute and the networking power. And that's really grown multifold. So it's not that we did not have data in a couple of domains. We used to, in the scientific domain, for example, we used to have a lot of data, but we did not really have the compute power to back it up and to do meaningful analysis of that data. Now, with the compute growing and continuing to grow exponentially, there's a lot of scope in terms of how we really put that to use and apply that. But coupled with that, then the third component, third leg in the stool essentially is the algorithms, which again have grown massively in power. And the algorithms have really become very inventive, creative in terms of how do we look at the data available, how do we put the compute to the best use, and then really leverage that to put this all together and find real solutions to the problems that we are facing as a society and our cities are facing essentially. But I would be amiss in not kind of mentioning about the fourth leg of the stool, which is missing here, which is around the connectivity or the 5G part. As we really have the advent of the 5G happening as we speak, that's going to really augur too well for how do we solve a lot of the world problems that we face. So 5G is going to put, remove all breaks that we had in terms of our processing powers and applying analytics to problems in the industry and cities as well. And we are reaching a point in time where we got ultra low latency, high bandwidth, and this is real-time applications of AI could be, which were really a pipe dream before, could be thought of and could be implemented and could be really leveraged to produce better outcomes across the globe, essentially. So what we'll do is we'll talk about a few of these use cases today in today's session. And I think what's one of the most pertinent areas to talk about really is the public safety and crime prevention. And India's track record has not been the greatest, I would say, in this regard. So what essentially can we do? Now, of course, we realize that there are real limitations to this. If we really do a benchmarking of where we stand with regards to the world in terms of deployment of police forces, of course, the numbers are way low. But is that really a kind of a constraint or bottleneck? I wouldn't think so. So essentially, if we apply technology, if we apply artificial intelligence to the problem, we could really grow this, grow ourselves out of this problem and essentially enter a regime where we are leveraging data very innovatively. And data has to be combined from multiple streams. So it's not video alone or surveillance alone on a standalone basis, which is going to create a lot of change for us. Essentially, what we have to do is we have to have data from multiple sources. These could be, closed sources. These could be open data sources. And essentially, then we have to look at how do we leverage that data to produce outcomes by having specific use cases around that. And I'm going to talk through an example in a minute about that. But essentially, what we are getting to is an era where we saw about 20 years ago, Minority Report. It was a movie which had Tom Cruise, and we're talking about predictive crime prevention. We have really entered that era now and entered that era in right earnest at scale. And that's really the future where we are going to predict crime, and we, if not eliminate crime, we are going to minimize crime by apply technologies like AI, which come to the rescue in this case. So what we really have as an example is something we call as multi-feature video search. And essentially what that does is you can take any sort of video feeds and scan through that at very fast speeds, essentially. And what you could also do is that you could apply up to about 1,000 different characteristics of what you're trying to look for in those video feeds, right? So essentially, it could be to do with any of the accessories a person is carrying, any of the clothing items they're wearing, the color of that clothing, the footwear, the multiple things could apply, the facial appearance of that person, the gender of the person. So there's so many factors one could apply, and really these algorithms, crunch out a lot of data across these hours and hours of video, and you could really find out where the issues lie, right? So if you were to replay back a situation and find where did a crime happen, for example, you could do that and search through it in seconds, not even minutes, and come to the. But more importantly, what does it, that's going to really translate outcomes is as soon as you become aware of the occurrence of something going wrong, right? An anomaly or alerts being generated, we could really put the scanner on the perpetrator of the crime and essentially keep tracking that person in flight in the direction of movement through various cameras along the way, and really lead to arrests and nip crime in the bud, essentially speaking. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about by applying artificial intelligence to the public safety problem. And these are the kind of signs of times to come where we will apply AI at scale to really transform our society and make it a safer, more secure society. The other one I wanted to talk about is related to public health. And this is a topic which is really apt in the current context and moment. Now, I must say that as India, we have fared far better than most of the developed nations in terms of our COVID response and dealing with COVID. But having said that, there are systemic challenges that remain from a public health standpoint. And we really need to address that upfront. India's got, again, a very limited budget towards healthcare. We spend about 1% on healthcare as compared to the advanced economies, which spend typically upwards of 10% of their GDP on healthcare. So we've got a very small budget to work out of. And then we have got, take it metrics like number of doctors per 100,000 population. We are way below the average benchmark there. So what do we do essentially? How do we apply technology? How do we apply AI into this particular problem? And how do we really solve for that? Now, essentially, while we have dealt with COVID pretty well as compared to the others, there are other epidemics and outbreaks that keep happening. And one has to really address that. And again, data can come to the rescue, right? So we would have to analyze multiple sources and feeds of data, orchestrate that data, find the underlying patterns and correlations, and really solve for these problems. And this is again data from a diversity of sources in terms of, it could be air and water quality data, it could be what's the demographic of a particular area. And we really go down to the specific problems in terms of how do we utilize this information and leverage AI for doing population health analysis and doing cohorts, doing risk stratification of how do you risk stratify the various cohorts and what sort of interventions then you need to kind of stem the tide of any potential likely outbreaks as they're happening. And that's really where the focus should be in terms of ensuring that we ensure better health outcomes for our population at large and do it at a fraction of the cost as compared to what the developed world does. Right? So the timing is right, the technology is mature, and we really need to go about and make it happen. So what that really translates into some sort of a AI-driven city-based health score, where you get a complete heat map of how different wards of the city are doing, and you have and this is a constantly evolving health score. So it's not a static one time, once a month kind of thing. So you really get constant inputs of data streaming in. And you get this constantly evolving picture of where these emerging threats are from a city standpoint and perspective, and how can I really make that happen and ensure that I'm dealing with this on a proactive, preemptive basis rather than as a post-factor thing. The second thing is also how do we utilize this then to be better prepared from our emergency responsiveness standpoint. And how do we do better demand capacity planning for hospitals, for example? So AI has got meaningful outcomes and impacts that one could really leverage in the public health space. So that's the second example I want to talk about. The third, very quickly, is around solid waste management. And this remains sort of a chronic problem in India. I think we are dealing with a very humongous problem at scale. India generates the second largest amount of solid waste in the globe. And that's putting a huge amount of pressure. And, we have a very abysmal record again in terms of cleanliness. None of our cities figure in the top 100 as an example. So how do we really apply AI to this problem? How do we solve for that? So essentially, it's about the efficiency of waste management. How do we optimize the whole pick cycles of waste? How do we really apply some more thinking around the whole problem? How do we even go to the tenets of the circular economy, right? And try to leverage the waste in terms of redeploying from a waste management standpoint, and then again a circular economy standpoint. So there's a lot of stuff that can be done, and again, there's AI is needed and come to the rescue on this particular problem. So what we have done is, this is again for one of the cities, is that we have a AI-driven solid waste collection optimization that happens. And this is used for routing the trucks in the appropriate way. It's also useful for dealing with situations where, you're en route and your truck gets full essentially. And so how do you deal with that? How do you kind of reroute trucks? How do you add trucks to the route and things like that? And we've done some innovative stuff around, leveraging mobile devices of drivers, for example, of these pickup trucks to understand what's the weight on the truck and giving them proactive inputs in terms of how they route the truck, where do they take it, and how many new trucks need to be deployed. So this is, again, a classic example of how we can apply AI to solve some really pressing problems and challenges that we have. Now, I would like to just kind of repivot and shift the scope from a city to a state, and leveraging this case study before I conclude and talk about what we did for the state of Andhra Pradesh a couple of years back. And this has been a really progressive state. So what we did is we implemented a real-time governance solution for them. And that involved implementing an integrated command and control center, which at the state level, which was, of course, interacting, interfacing with about 16 different district level command centers. And essentially what we try to address is, if you see a state as really a macrocosm of a city, right? So a state has got all the problems that the cities have because cities are a part of a state, but then there's a few more, and the few more pertain to issues which are particularly pertinent to the rural masses or the rural economy, and how do we really handle with that and deal with that. So we really focused on the Sustainable Development Goals as set by the UN General Assembly and focused on a few select of those to try and optimize the overall state performance. And this was in areas like, congestion management, traffic management, crime prevention, emergency response management, agriculture, and a host of other things like public distribution system. How do you make that more efficient? How do you avoid any leakages from the public distribution system? How do you ensure that the benefits accrue to the citizens as intended? So those are sort of challenges that we grapple with. And of course, in that context, you have to integrate with the diversity of different subsystems which are associated with the various departments in the state. You have to leverage innumerable open data sources to kind of bring it all together and have a holistic picture of how the state is operating and have a sort of a red, amber, green dashboard across various metrics so that you're able to take a proactive action on areas that need attention from a state standpoint. So what are the things that we did in this context is around agriculture. And clearly the challenge there was how can we help the farmers earn more money, right, from their produce, and how do we ensure that they get the right outcomes? How do they grow the right crops, harvest it on a timely basis? How do they really use the right amount of nutrients and fertilizers, and how do they minimize the usage of water as well while doing that? And India water, I think we think it's a free resource, and some statistics point to the fact that we use in certain states, at least in the north, at least thrice the amount of water that should be used for a particular crop. So that's the sheer waste. So we did apply AI to this particular challenge, and we did the analysis of a large amount of data on the soil health, soil micronutrients, and couple that with the external data like the weather feeds. And essentially, this has got a real business case in terms of how do you define what is the right crop to grow given the soil classification, the nutrients in the soil, given the time of the year, given how many crop rotational patterns you could deploy and things like that. And this is what we really address in terms of how do we enable better outcomes for farmers, how do we help them gain more from their crop, get better productivity, and get better price realization for the crop and stuff like that. So that's really what we did. And outcome was essentially that we realized that some districts are using excessive fertilizers, some are using a lot more water as opposed to what they were supposed to do. And essentially, if you really produce a business case around this, then the gross value add could be in the thousands of crores, essentially, just for a state, just for a particular year we're talking about. So that's the amount of efficiencies that AI can bring in and help us drive in this context. So that's, again, a good example of how we can apply artificial intelligence. So in conclusion and wrapping up, we are just getting started with AI, I would say, in the smart cities and even the smart state context. The potential is really endless, and what we are looking at is, we're just beginning. Things are just beginning to happen, and we haven't seen nothing yet, as they say. So the scope is tremendous, and the onus is really on us to apply, think innovatively, create solutions which are creative in terms of addressing some genuine societal challenges, and then rising up to the occasion to really make it happen. So with that, thank you so much for listening into this session, and appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Devnani, for sharing your expert inputs on the role of artificial intelligence in the real cities space. Now we'll proceed to the next session. Stay tuned.